Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the coffee break and connected with other scholars in view of future collaborations, partnerships, and so on. In fact, I think that very rarely we get a chance to sit down with other peers, scholars, and talk about ideas, theories, research projects that haven't actually impacted communities or may inform our work with Romani people and families and individuals. Once again, my name is Matache. I'm the director of the Roma program at Harvard University, and I will moderate this session. Please also note that I will briefly introduce our panelists, but you will find their full abstracts in the booklet of abstracts. Is that available online? Yes. Or in the on the page of the event? And let me please introduce our first speakers. Ciprian-Valentin Nodis is a Roma activist from Bistrița, Romania. He owns a BA in environmental science from the Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj. In 2015, he graduated with an MA in public administration from the School of Public Policy at Central European University in Budapest. Ciprian has conducted research on environmental justice as a field researcher for CEU Romani Studies Program and the Environmental Bureau in Brussels. Ionut Cioarta is a Roma scholar from Romania and holds a PhD in social work and social policy from Strathclyde University in Glasgow, Scotland. His research varies from social work and Roma activism to studies approaching social justice, homelessness, racism, and universal basic income. Currently, Ionut works as an academic tutor for Glasgow University and collaborates with Roma local organizations in Glasgow. Ashok Kumar Pindiga graduated with an MA in political science from Central European University. He also holds an LLM degree from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. His previous work experience includes a research assistantship in South Asia studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Ashok is also the editor of a volume entitled Dr. Ambedkar and Social Justice Towards an Egalitarian Social Order Research. Elana Resnick will join us online, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and faculty affiliate in the interdepartmental PhD emphasis in environment and society, as well as the Department of Feminist Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's also the director of the Infrastructural Inequalities Research Group Lab, a collaborative space for community engaged research and its real-world impacts. Jekatyerina Dunajeva, PhD, is a researcher at the Center for Social Sciences and an assistant professor of political sciences at Pázmány, Péter, Catholic University. She's also the author of a book entitled Constructing Identities Over Time. Her research has been published in multiple book chapters and peer-reviewed journals, exploring topics such as environmental justice, Roma identity, discrimination, youth politics, nationalism, and many others. Diego Marin will also join us online. He works as a policy officer for environmental justice within the Economic Transition Unit at the European Environmental Bureau. He holds a master's in international development from the University of Kent, Brussels Schools of International Studies. At the EEB, he's leading the work on environmental justice by analyzing how policies create environmental burdens for racialized communities. And finally, our discussant, who will arrive soon, is Aron Buzogany. I think I may mispronounce his name, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Forest, Environmental and Natural Resource Policies at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to listening to your presentations. It's really a great pleasure to have you all as our guests. The title of our panel is Waste, Recycling and Racism. And as the title suggests, this panel will continue our conversation about the nexus between power resources, state violence, and environmental racism and the health, well-being, and labor of those that states stamp as unworthy lives. Each panelist or team will have about 15 minutes to present their paper, and afterwards I will invite our discussant to provide reflections, suggestions, and comments on those papers. So I would like to invite Ciprian and Ionut, if you'd like to join the conversation, to really kick off this discussion and present their paper entitled Environmental Racism Against Roma, a case study of the Pázmány community in Romania. Ciprian, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. I always have this problem with speaking too slow. I will try to be loud. I hope you had a great, refreshing break. I also want to say that I'm proud to announce that together with my co-writer, my colleague Ionut, we are alumni of the Roma Graduate Preparation Program. That was so long ago, like 10 years ago. But yeah, it's good to be back at CU, and especially in a new town. We have put together a draft of the paper after we did some research and field research in Pázmány, which is in the northwest part of Romania. It's in the outskirts of the city of Cluj-Napoca. Now, I would like to talk to you, just to offer some information about a general environmental racism definition that we are working on in our paper, to make a link between the environmental racism and the atrocity, which is called climate change, and to bring the context of the Roma communities that are affected by these phenomena in Romania. I will give some basic data about the history of Roma discrimination in Romania. Then we'll move on to the most important thing, which is the case of Pázmány. In our paper, we are talking also about some provisions of the international legislation and also the national legislation regarding the housing standards and how a house should be, actually. We have also some testimonials. We have some interviews from people who live in Pázmány. Of course, they prefer to remain anonymous, but we present what they are saying in our paper. And we will end up with some general conclusion and some policy recommendations. Now, environmental racism, because the previous panel didn't give a definition. In Romania, according to what happened in various cases, and this is not only about Pázmány, it happened in Baia in Miercurea, in Constanța, and in many other places in Romania. Unfortunately, there is a pattern where people belonging to a certain ethnic minority group, and we are talking about Roma in the case of Romania, are forcibly evicted by the local authorities and then relocated to places where there is almost no access to infrastructure, where the level of pollution is very high. I'm talking about air, soil, and water pollution as well. And they don't have the means to defend themselves. They have low level of employment, very low level of education, and so on. So basically, the local authorities, they take them by force, they evict them, and then they relocate them in highly polluted areas, in the proximity of wastewater treatment plants, former chemical factories, in the proximity of the landfill, as in the case of Pázmány. And this is our working definition of environmental risk, and we will see that in the case of Pázmány, it definitely complies to the definition. So all of these things are present in the case of Pázmány. Unfortunately, in Romania, and not only in Romania, when we talk about environmental racism, it's very complicated to frame it properly and for this, we cannot fight it or combat it, because there are experts who say that this is an issue about infringement of human rights. This others say that this is only about the issue of housing. There are experts or activists who say that this is about health, the right to health violation, and they are all right in a way. They have some solid arguments, but actually environmental racism is such a complex phenomenon that comprises all of these issues together. It's difficult to frame it, and unfortunately, even some of my professors from my previous university back in Cluj, I hope they don't live here us. When they first heard about, when I was talking to them about environmental racism in 2007, 2008, they were saying like, come on, what is this? It's just like another concept invented by you, Roma, about it and to convey about discrimination. This was happening actually in Cluj-Napoca, where the Péter case it's right there in front of their eyes. So yeah, we have an issue in Romania to frame it properly in order to combat it. Now, because it's such a big problem and it has so many components, we were focusing in our paper about the housing issues. Now, according to the Romanian strategy to combat gas emissions and to improve the climate environment, there is a big concern that in 20 or 30 years, the temperatures will go up from 2 even to 5 degrees from what they are now. And this will mean a total disaster in Romania. And of course, the effects are still yet to be seen. For example, the winters will get more colder. The summers will be without precipitation. And guess what? Who are the most affected by this issue? So of course, the ones who are living in improper housing conditions. When I'm thinking about the Péter case and the other cases where there is environmental racism, Roma people will be unfortunately the most affected, or the first who are affected by these issues. Now, this is the link that we wanted to create between environmental racism and climate change. For example, in the Péter case, there were, unfortunately not once, but many times when they were trying to heat their improvised shelters, and then the fire burned, and one shelter to another and another, they were all burning, and the firefighters couldn't get there because of the geography of the place. And many children lost their lives, innocent children, just because they were trying to heat their homes. In Romania, the general situation of housing is it doesn't look so good, and especially when we look about the data on the Roma segregated places, it's a lot worse. And I was wondering, okay, so environmental racism is taking place in Romania and many different regions, and how come that this is happening in a country that is part of EU and blah, blah, blah? Well, actually, it didn't happen just from today or yesterday. As our colleague from Turkey was saying, that also in the case of Romania, we are talking about institutionalized racism or discrimination against Roma that is deeply rooted in history. We have many issues in our history. For example, in the first we were mentioning the 14th century in an official document as slaves. I think that about 40 Roma families were given by a ruler to a monastery as a gift. So we were treated as objects. This lasted until 1885 or 1886 in Moldavia. And the slavery was abolished, but the bad thing is that Roma were still depending on their former owners because they didn't receive land or properties and so on. Even though they were unofficially free, they were still treated as slaves. and they had to act like this in order to survive. And then, of course, the Holocaust came. So many Roma lost their lives just because they were Roma. After that, the communism, where everybody should be equal to one another. But guess what? Some are more equal than the others. And Roma and Romania were forcibly assimilated. A lot of them lost their traditional jobs and started to work as unskilled workers in various branches of the industry. But after the falling of the communists, the democracy didn't treat us so well. We were the first one to lose our jobs. We were again the losers of the regime. And this is how ghettos were created and segregated areas in villages and so on. We can see this tendency, even though we are about 2 or 2.5 Roma in Romania. According to the official data, we are a quarter of that number. So basically, environmental racism is just one form of the continuing discrimination that is taking on towards Roma and Romania. It hasn't stopped in history, it's going on nowadays. It's taking place offline, online, and environmental racism is one of the most visible methods in which Roma are discriminated. And because the picture speaks more than 1,000 words, these are some images from Patarât. Imagine that Cluj-Napoca is one of the largest cities in Romania. It's a developing city. We have many university centers. A lot of young people come there from all over the country to start a future, and it's a nice place to live. But if you go like 5 or 6 kilometers away from Cluj-Napoca, you will feel like you're on another planet. Basically, at the landfill of the city, there is the community Patarât. There are about 2,000 Roma living there. Most of them in improvised shelters, as you can see here, made out of, I don't know, whatever materials they can find at the trash dump. And they live in unimaginable conditions. Imagine how the effects of the climate change will affect their lives. They have almost no access to infrastructure. The air is polluted, the soil is polluted, the water is polluted as well. There is this substance called levigate that drains from the landfill and goes into the soil and pollutes the water, and everything is messed up. Unfortunately, many of these guys were forcibly evicted and relocated by the local authorities. Even in 2010, the last comers in Patarât came there in 2010, evicted by the local authorities, and they are the most active. They started an NGO together with the help of ERC and Amnesty International. And many of them were working in the city. The children were going to school. They were integrated in the life of the city, but since they moved to Patarât, their future was messed up. So in our paper, we're talking about the housing legislation. There is this brochure made issued by the High Commissioner of Human Rights of UN, which comprises at least 7 chapters. And there is also the Romanian legislation, which is, let's say, it's poorer than the UN. But most definitely, you don't need to be an expert to see that the conditions in Patarât, the living conditions in Patarât, do not comply with the international or national law. And the basic conclusion of the main idea is that discrimination towards Roma in Romania hasn't stopped. It continues nowadays in various forms, and environmental racism is one of these. And we have we came up with 4 policy recommendations, but of course we are open to hear your ideas as well to help us with that. One of these would be to educate the local authorities, because not only in the cities, but also in the rural areas in Romania, the local authorities are usually unaware about the provisions of the law. Housing. Another idea would be to involve the marginalized Roma from these communities in the so-called social entrepreneurship. There are cases in Romania where, for example, people like this were employed by social entrepreneurship. They were building their homes and they're selling again materials. So they were like solving two issues: the employment and the housing at the same time. To condemn abuses, because there are many officials in Romania in the last years who are like making discriminatory. They were coming out on television and they were talking discriminatory words towards Roma, and they were not punished for that. To change legislation to make the Ares Convention a powerful tool. The Ares Convention basically allows people from a certain community to be aware of the environmental factors affecting their community or another place where they will be relocated. I think that's it from me.
Ionut, would you like to add something? Not yet. Thank you so much, Ciprian. This is such an important paper, and it also gives us an opportunity to really look comparatively at the cases of environmental racism and injustice that happen against Roma in various parts of Europe. And perhaps similarly to the case of Mitrovica, we can see that in the case of Pázmány, we see these communities situated somehow between past and present, between neglect and protest, between case law and social work done by various communities and organizations. And it's also interesting, Ciprian, that how you alluded to this idea that scholars would not conceptualize what happens in Pázmány, although that mountain of waste is in your face whenever you pass by Pázmány. And this somehow led me to the conversation about racism. Many historians argue that racism was born along with the theories of race in the 19th century in Europe, but yet we have this practice of racism that has been there way before that. So thank you so much for this thoughtful and insightful presentation. And now I would like to invite Elana Resnick to introduce her paper called Critical Environmental Justice. Elana?
No, so Katia and Diego now. Yes. And then,
okay,
they were
perfect. I didn't know that. Okay, then Katia and Diego Martin, thank you so much. And your presentation is called Environmental Justice and Slow Violence, the case of Roma informal recycler communities. Please, you have the floor. I assume that Katia, you start and then you.
No, Diego will actually start, right?
Okay, Diego, you have the floor.
Yes, sorry. Hi, everyone. Good to see you, and thank you very much for having us today. Really excited about this, and also to develop the conversations on environmental justice, which is very much understudied at the moment in Europe, at least, but it is gaining much more popularity. So that's good to hear. So for our report, initially this was a report that we did an upcoming paper as well. Was basically as a part of a project that we had. Is titled Roma and COVID-19, Build Back Better Through Sustainable Waste Management. This was in 2002. This was in partnership with UWD, an environmental NGO in Austria. And it was also funded by the Federal Ministry of Austria, Social Affairs and Health Care and Consumer Protection. And also this was done in collaboration with the Roma Entrepreneur Development Initiative, also known as READY. Lastly, this also built up on a much larger and comprehensive report by Blażej Józefowski, in which is also part of the project at large. Basically, he looked into the circular economy, the laws within North Macedonia, and also the conditions that Roma communities involved as informal recyclers deal with. However, on our project, we actually did it a little bit more looking into not only just what is happening in terms of policy and such. We actually looked at it more from a critical angle and approached the concept of informal recyclers not only as people that are impoverished, but also what are the underlying conditions that lead them to this type of livelihood, right? So within this study, we looked into 5 locations in North Macedonia. The field research was done in June and July with one of our researchers on the ground who conducted interviews. And then that was basically the framework. So I'll maybe next slide, please. Maybe. Yes, just to make sure. Yes, exactly. So I'll pass it over now to you, Katia, for the analytical framework.
Okay, let me just mention for the study and methodology. So we're building on these 2 pillars. One is the report that we have written that is aiming more at the general audience and also the policymakers. So for that, there were 5 case studies, and Diego will talk about them in a moment. And then Reddy has conducted a study with a more comprehensive, so interviewing 512 waste collectors in 15 cities of North Macedonia. This is publicly available, so maybe some of you have read this report. So we've used some of their data also in order to assess the situation. So what we're trying to do, and inviting all of you to help us think about it and how best to analyze or to frame the situation of Roma, is merging the critical environmental justice framework or theory with slow violence. And I'll have another slide on the environmental or critical environmental justice. But basically what we've all talked about so far is that there is a social dimension of environmental pollution. Not everybody is exposed to environmental pollution to the same extent. On a global scale, even though we haven't talked about globally yet, but what we're also seeing is some countries are producing more waste and they get to export their waste, sell it to other countries. Other countries might be producing less waste, but they're taking the waste from some of the richer countries. So on a global scale too, there is highly visible inequality when it comes to both garbage producing and dealing with garbage, facing garbage. This is what we're seeing on a local level as well with some of the Roma communities, is that, and not only Roma communities, but of course the environmental justice debate has started way earlier, 50s and 60s, looking at racialized communities in the US and beyond, and how they are more exposed to environmental damage than others. So this disproportionality of environmental burden is what I think all of us are pointing out in our discussions. And what we want to argue is that this being exposed to environmental racism is also a form of slow violence. And we find this framework very suitable for this debate because, as you see, this is the definition of slow violence. It's violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. And I also think that throughout some of the previous discussions, we've mentioned or we've noticed that some of this violence remains out of sight. It's not something that we see. By we, I mean the general population sees. It's not something that is often discussed because it is out of sight. So I'll have a visual for the slow violence, but epistemic violence is necessarily part of it, as in not being able to not only contribute to knowledge, but also being branded as something. For example, with the informal recyclers, they are often named as unemployed, whereas for them, they perceive it as a form of employment. So this is part of this epistemic violence as well. And then graduality of contamination and hazards. So it's very hard to point out where contamination is happening because the boundaries of it are also either expansive or hard to delineate. It's ambiguous in many instances too, especially when there is wires being burned, right? So the environmental pollution, the air pollution is also something that cannot be located to one specific area, but will be dispersed across. And it's something that will be probably visible over time. So not that right moment somebody will get sick, but probably in 5 years, the accumulated health consequences will be visible. But again, it's hard to connect the source of these health problems. So this is why we wanted to use this low violence as another framework and see if we can merge the two to better understand and account for the situation of Roma in North Macedonia. North Macedonia taken as a case study. And then this is the critical environmental justice pillars that I've mentioned earlier. So it considers intersectionality, which is in our case very important. And again, many of you have mentioned that there are many forms of discrimination that these communities face. And the critical environmental justice framework can account for many of them. The state, we've also paid a lot of attention to how the state reacts or behaves in relation to these informal recyclers in North Macedonia. So oftentimes it's not only the violation of their rights, but the inaction from state agencies or local governments to act. In some of our case studies, there were attempts by local authorities to act, but they were very quickly stopped by the non-Roma population, who, for example, were very displeased that Roma would be moved closer to the city. They preferred them out of sight. So nothing happened from the side of the authorities. And then indispensability, which will also come back in our discussion here as well. So the recognition of the dispensability of marginalized populations and species that are often, well, we've not talked about species in our debate, but are often treated as expendable. I mean, it's with animals because a lot of this framework is applied to animals as well. So we'll come back to some of these in our discussion. And here you go. So these are case studies, and the pictures are also taken by from the ground.
Yes, thank you very much, Katya, for that framework. Additionally to that, the reason why we wanted to adopt the critical environmental justice framework was because we believe that the environmental justice analysis, the traditional way of looking into disproportionate citing of environmental hazards in communities of color and low-income communities, did not provide us a good enough analysis of the current situation when it comes to informal recyclers in North Macedonia, which is why Kati mentioned the 4 pillars of critical environmental justice. And within these case studies that I will speak about, these framework of critical environmental justice really comes into it really comes in handy because we're able to really see how the injustices are pretty much recreated in a sort of vicious cycle, and how these injustices on the material level create then in a sense toxic narratives that reinforce this vicious cycle, right? Toxic narratives, I mean, in terms of non-Roma communities, even sometimes living around them, that justify the injustices to continue. And this is particularly important on the last point that Katya mentioned on expendability, right? So anyway, this is for the first case study, for example. And maybe before I say that, I just want to say that there are around 3,000 to 5,000 informal recyclers in all of Macedonia. So in the first case study, we chose these case studies mainly because our contact on the ground had already a relationship with these communities. So he has been there before. I mean, it's difficult to access and also to get the communities to trust an outsider. So he is Roma himself, and he physically went there to interview communities there. So basically, yeah, in the first one, in the Neke Mahala community, basically around 200 Roma people living in 18 houses. The issues that they're having there is also, for example, they're left with little support, little state support, lack of amenities such as electricity, waters, and sewage systems. Many of the residents are actually unemployed within the informal recycle community there. Many of them are also women. It's also important to know that the residents have generally difficulty accessing services. Many of them have difficulties in accessing even minimal social assistance due to lack of personal documents. So this lack of personal documents not only excludes them from the social system, but also including their children, who are prevented, of course, from attending education as well. Many of the communities there, of course, living unfortunately in cramped and small spaces, so housing is of course an issue. So during the pandemic, during COVID-19, non-Roma residents were viewed as a source of contagion. So there was generally a lack of support for these communities in general. And also when speaking to how the informal recycling sector was really important for them in terms of accessing the plastics, many of them were unfortunately unable to do so because police and cordoning of the community itself issued a situation in which they could no longer gain access to that livelihood, which is the role of the state in the case of critical environmental justice. Really helps us analyze that portion. And yeah, so in another one, just to move quickly because we're limited time, the municipality of Stip, this is perhaps one of the most egregious cases that we found. Yeah, some small Roma communities living in this abandoned neurology ward. It used to be part of a smaller hospital. The living conditions, again, are substandard, mainly makeshift dwellings from scavenged materials such as cardboard and wood that provide these makeshift homes for the community there. Inadequate housing and overcrowding is of course an issue, but so is a lack of access to water. What happens is that in this case study, many of the communities were actually tapping public access to water that was not really for them, but they were tapping into that to provide water for them. So they did take some agency, of course, and to provide some sort of services for themselves. So including that, there's also issues with mold and flooding, of course, which causes respiratory and gastrointestinal problems for the children, particularly. In terms of why it was one of the most egregious cases was because the community next to them, so that community was actually the Roma community there in the old neurology ward, was facing over years targeted attacks from non-Roma communities, which included attempts to set the homes on fire, which the residents attributed, of course, to anti-Gypsyism, but also as attempts to expel them out of that location. The municipality of Stip, for example, in January 2022, had already agreed, in a sense, to provide prefabricated homes for the communities there. But unfortunately, as of the writing of the case study, which was more in the summer, there was no concrete plans on actually how these prefabricated homes would look like, whether they would be done, and how many they would house. So there is still lack of clarity on that end. Yeah, so maybe we can move over to the next one. I could not, unfortunately, no longer go for the rest of them.
Okay, let's talk about, we talk fast and the time's still goes so fast. Anyways, so in terms of our findings, so we thought what was interesting is really the paradox that has come through in all of the case studies. On the one hand, waste was clearly a source of income for many of the residents. Relying on actually the research done by Reddy, they counted about 33%, so 1/3 of the waste pickers in Macedonia rely on waste. And during the fieldwork, and fieldwork, by the way, was done by Mustafa Asanovsky, there were a lot of quotes about the difficulties accessing waste during COVID-19, and that was actually threatening some of the livelihoods. So access to waste under the circumstances that the waste recyclers were living in was actually something that they needed to make ends meet. And many of them actually referred to waste picking as a kind of self-employment or a family business. So that came through interviews. And also I have another quote. This is a different study. So in general, outside of the Romani studies as well, waste pickers' access to waste is something that is highlighted as an important right of waste pickers to have. On the other hand, or the other side of this paradox, is obviously being exposed to waste is a health hazard. So this is a complicated situation because on the one hand, there's the urge of helping and getting people out of the waste sites, but on the other hand, if nothing else is provided as a support for income, then that is being taken away by relocating the waste pickers. And this is just on a theoretical level. And again, this is a big question for policymakers also, how to deal with waste recyclers in especially Eastern Europe. Okay, so these are just some examples of how this is polluting, for example, the metal-bearing waste and burning of wires. But this also has come through. We found a lot of articles also from various countries where especially newspapers are finding it as a conundrum. Why would somebody do that if this is so bad for the health, it's so bad for the environment? Well, they obviously do because there's no other way of making ends meet than to burn those wires and sell the metal. And again, internationally, a few studies we're mentioning here. This is something that is well acknowledged, that the more exposure to waste there is, the more not only health hazards, but also mental health issues. And that has not been inquired into, especially within, again, the Roma waste recyclers, how that is affecting, for example, mental health, not only the physical health. Okay, so one is the paradox that we found interesting. Again, what is garbage for the lives of the informal recyclers? The abandonment, what we mentioned earlier in terms of the case studies. So oftentimes the state's inactions have contributed to the problem too, or the state selectively helping or not helping, not providing access or actually barricading access to the waste during COVID-19 was a particularly issue that many of the interviewers suggested. And then the discursive linking of Roma with dirt and garbage has come through quite explicitly through the interviews as well. And this is also that we're seeing through other research as well. Roma people are commonly referred to by politicians, for example, as having dirty ways of life, depicting Roma communities as itinerant dumps and referring to them as epidemiological hazard, and that we've seen during COVID-19 especially. And this is where this disposable people narrative comes in. So the disposable life, expendable people, those who don't deserve help has come through. Well, I talked about that and we probably don't have time anymore. Let me just read very quickly this quote. This is from Eric Seithra's work. He was actually conducting field work and living with recyclers. And he writes, scavengers were the antithesis of customers because they took items from without making payment. Ashkali scavengers were transformed into thieves. Scavenging resurrected abject commodities, complicated notions of public and private property, and blurred the lines between worth and worthlessness. And I thought this quote very well describes what we see, for example, is part of the epistemic violence as well, is how we label certain activities. He here describes, for example, the experience of Roma scavengers trying to collect empty cardboard boxes from various stores. So taking what was garbage for other people were nevertheless depicted as a behavior of a thief. They were stolen, even though it was garbage that they wanted to use for recycling. So how it's framed is also an important aspect. And in the report that we've written with Diego, we've also pointed out that there are different examples, especially in Latin America, where people were legalized who were doing informal recycling. They've formed a union of some sort, and they, for example, are bidding for various opportunities to treat waste. So here in Europe, we're not there yet. This is not being practiced, even though in Latin America, there are many cases of informal recyclers actually joining as a bottom-up movement and demanding some rights, but within the framework of continuing their work as waste recyclers. So this is also another paradox, is how we consider this type of work. And just as the last slide, I want to show you this picture. I actually took it in Cluj-Napoca next to Patara. And what struck me about the picture, the colored one, is that this is a lot of work. Picking waste, carrying waste from one place to another. And this really highlights how really calling somebody doing all that work unemployed is really not doing justice to the amount of work that is actually being done. The other pictures are not original pictures, we took them from other reports, but this is where we see all of this combined, the structural violence, epistemic violence, and the slow violence together. I don't think the paper currently does justice of uniting these three elements, but at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is show how these three aspects of violating or of discriminating certain communities through the case of environment and informal recyclers shows an aspect of environmental injustice. And I'll just
Thank you very much.
If I may add one last thing, is there possible, just 30 seconds?
Diego, just 2 seconds, because I've already gave you like 20 minutes.
oh.
Sorry, I didn't hear it. What did you say?
Yeah, go ahead, sure. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, just really quickly. On the point of indispensability, it's also really important to note on the contribution that informal recyclers give actually to society at large. So just to give you an idea, and just really quickly, an average informal recycler collects around 3.7 tons of waste per day, right? Which translates over to 74 kilograms, 74 kilograms of waste per day, or 11 kilograms per hour. This, over the period of a monthly basis, translates to a single Roma waste collector treating and dealing with rubbish of 27 Macedonians. So this term of indispensability of how important this sector is actually for the well-being of society at large is completely misunderstood within society, and actually criminalized as well. So I just wanted to end on that more a positive note as well on the importance of recognizing this type of work.
Thank you so much, Katya and Diego. And I do apologize for having to show you these signs. These are the instructions that I received from the organizers, so it's not my fault. But also, you know, based on our experience, we know that sometimes if we take too much time, then the panelists who are lost will have less time. So let's just, no, we don't want this. Barely visible here.
Hello, everyone. At the outset, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak on this topic. And today, my presentation will stress the causes of scavenging work in Europe. As Buddha 2000 years back said, if you have to remove the suffering, you must identify the cause. To me, scavenging work is a form of suffering, suffered in large numbers by the Romani people in Europe. First, let me talk about the cause and consequences of scavenging work. And I would see scavenging as a symptom of crisis. During the Great Depression in the United States in the 1930s, 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed, and people survived by scavenging and selling metals back. People would roam the streets in search of food. Children would beg in front of the houses of wealthy people. The Great Depression between 1998 and 2002 also resulted in 25% of people being unemployed, and during that period, people resorted to scavenging for survival. Approximately, on any given day, 40,000 people would roam the streets to collect cardboard and sell it to the recycling plants. In Asia, particularly in Pakistan, the Afghan refugees make up 2/3 of the scavenging population. And the primary reason why the unemployed enter waste picking for survival is that there are no barriers, meaning no competitions or skills required. Even though they earn little from it, it could serve their immediate needs. Now, according to estimates in Europe, there are about 1 million people, persons engaged in the scavenging or recycling works. And most waste pickers in the European Union belong to one, or in cases, 2 of these extremely vulnerable groups. Persons of Roma ethnicity who have very low educational level and are the targets of range of social exclusion measures. The second case is pensioners, elderly persons without family, and homeless excluded from the labor market for a number of other reasons. So due to paucity of time, I shall be discussing 2 consequences of scavenging work. Number 1 is health. For example, in France, in 2010 alone, France generated 1.5 million tons of electronic waste. The EU Waste and Electronic Equipment Directive obligates the manufacturer to collect electronic waste. But despite the directive, the collection of e-waste has been low, and it ends up in dustbins, and Roma people engaged in scavenging work collect electronic waste from the containers. At the same time, they do not have the requisite skills or the safety equipment to break down the items made of toxic materials. According to a French doctor, Bernard Moreau, who examined people who lived in Roma settlement near Paris, stated, warning about the dangers to health does not compel them, meaning Roma, to change, because this is their only means of survival. evicted Roma settlements near Lyon. It was found that the site was contaminated with heavy metals known to cause cancer. Similarly, in 3 other settlements in France. However, these findings did not alarm the public authorities in France. So, in addition to the health hazards, the health hazards has several issues. Respiratory diseases due to polluted skin infection, typhoid, and cancer due to long-term exposure of toxics. And then the second consequence, which is loss of dignity. Ladies and gentlemen, in ancient Rome, touching waste was considered stigma. Therefore, slaves were made to dispose waste of the wealthy. People who cleaned the sewers in Rome were considered the lowest class of people. In the Indian subcontinent, the Hindu religious texts have considered dealing with waste as polluting activity. The Hindu religious texts assigned this work to the Chandalas, presently they're known as Dalits. And even till today, the former untouchables, presently known as Dalits, are engaged as cleaners, sanitation workers, and scavengers. Buraku in Japan, considered outcasts, are made to dispose of the waste. Even in the United States, where dignity of labor exists, but scavenging as a vocation or activity is stigmatic, people engaging in that work are viewed by the mainstream as mainstream society with less value. In a study conducted by Rosa and Claudia and Romanian people involved in waste picking in Turin, and it was found that in addition to the health problems, the negative image of people dealing with dirt, waste, and impure matter worsens the situations for those people involved. Therefore, waste picking is marked by a paradox. It reintroduced the value to the item that was disposed of as without value, but at the same time, it marginalizes the person engaged in that activity. Therefore, this moral ambiguity makes it hard for the person to do this work. The media and the public authorities depict the Roma settlements accumulated with objects and collected materials as unhygienic. However, the depiction is not true. If actually one visits the house in the settlements, it's actually clean and tidy. According to Eric Safri, who studied scavenging work in Serbia, Rosa Claudia studied in Italy, and Ina Machko studied in Albania, they've all come to a same conclusion, and that is, as a mainstream society discards material that is without value, at the same time, it also views people involved in picking that material as people without value. Therefore, I also want to highlight from Ina's study in Albania, the non-Roma presumed persons who are involved in scavenging as only Roma, even if others are involved. Now, let me come to the underlying causes of Romas in scavenging work. Now, according to the World Bank 2005 estimates, there was about 100% unemployment in certain Roma neighborhoods in Europe. In addition, the transition to the market economy has harmed Roma employment in the job market in Central and Eastern Europe. The economic reforms, privatization of state industries has led to large-scale unemployment of Roma people. They were the first in the queue to be laid off. This, coupled with the anti-Roma attitude among the general population, also contributed to the joblessness of the Roma people. For example, in Hungary, the economic changes particularly affected the sectors which employed Roma in large numbers, and therefore the jobs they lost were on a large scale. According to estimates, some 55% of the jobs previously filled by Roma were terminated at the beginning of the 90s, in contrast to 33% of the total jobs. And most of them were unable to return to the labor market consequently, and they became long-term unemployment and passed their difficulties to the younger generation. According to the 2010 Hungarian estimates, the employment rate of the Roma population barely reached 20%, and it is 10% for Roma women. Yeah, so at present, the percentage of Roma people in acute poverty is higher than the other ethnic groups in Europe. So this is a Fundamental Rights Agency 2021 report. So the orange is marked for the other ethnicities, which are not Roma. And then the light blue is the 2016 estimate, and then the dark blue is the 2021. You see, there's not much difference between 2021 and 2016. So now, according to the 2021 report, 80% of Romani people surveyed in Europe are at risk of poverty. And like as I said, there's no significant progress from the last findings in 2016. 29% of Roma children are likely to live in a household where hunger is a norm. 94% of Roma children live in crowded houses. Approximately 24% live in houses without access to running water. And these figures are coupled with extremely poor rate of health. Roma people die 10 years younger than Roma on an average. And crime and conflicts are particularly rife in these areas. And in the FRA survey, the Fundamental Rights Agency survey in 2021, approximately 56% of Roma aged between 16 and 24 were unemployed, not in education and training. And there's also unacceptable levels of discrimination in the workplace and also at the time of looking for a job. Czech Republic, and then Portugal and Romania, I think they've been having a consistent, they've been maintaining a consistent level of high levels of discrimination in the workplace, as well as when you're looking for work. Now, now, if you look at the equality bodies, the position of the equality bodies in Europe, on average, half of the Romani residents interviewed have heard of at least one equality body, National Human Rights Institution, or Ombudsman's office in that body. But at the same time, out of 100 people discriminated, only 5% reported discrimination to these equality bodies. According to Isabella Chopin, the Roma equality policies are not a priority for the equality commissions in the EU. They symbolically deal with the Roma issues. In addition to that, there are several challenges to the functioning of equality bodies in Europe. The issues range from understaffing, public awareness, and independence. Now, let me come to the EU strategic framework. Now, to eradicate poverty of Romani people, you draw the money from European Social Fund, so which at present is about 99.3 billion euros. So it's also called the main instrument for investing in people and supporting the implementation of social rights. Now, at present, the countries have to spend 25% of the social fund for the rights of the disadvantaged. But there are several issues that plague the implementation or the allocation. There's no clear evidence on the percentage of funds allocated to eradicate the poverty of Roma people. Now, the European Union Roma fact sheet for 2007 and 2013 that is available on the Roma strategy for individual countries, but I could not find for the 2014 to 2020. Now, according to the previous EU guidelines, the member countries would have to spend 20% of the social fund, but I've not come across countries that actually do that. Okay. So in 2017-13, Portugal just spent 6% of the social funds that they have, but these are not explicitly for Roma people. The same goes even for Bulgaria. They just spent 3.2%, and you don't find them again mentioning that it's exclusively for Roma people, but they use disadvantage to include all the other communities. Similarly, Hungary just allocated 8.8% of its total European social fund for integrating the disadvantaged people. So due to paucity of time, I'm not going into the details of this. Now, for 2014 and 2020, countries have been allocated billions of euros for European social funds. And then from the social fund, countries would have to spend towards promoting social inclusion and combating poverty. And I made a rough calculation for the numbers available on the EU website. And let me read out and how the allocation exists on the EU website. And let me give you, with paucity of time, let me give you an example for only France. Now, and I quote, for 2014 and 2020, France will be allocated a total of 15.9 billion under the cohesive policy, and at least 41.7% of this will be spent on the ESF, and with at least 20% of that going towards promoting social inclusion and combating poverty. Hence, if you look at the number of countries and then so it's in millions. So this is the amount that they have to spend to eradicate poverty and also for social inclusion. And then the fact sheets for the 2014 and 2020 are not available. And then the wording used in the national strategy is ambiguous and evading. For example, the latter amount could also benefit Roma-related measures. The latter could also finance Roma-related measures, but never that it must or it will. And I've gone through the Roma strategy country reports for 2010 to 2020. I've not come across having a quota as such. Quota is a very important tool to address inequality. And I think a policy must be made for allocation of funds. If you turn to India, so there's an exclusive law to monitor the funds for the Dalits and the other marginalized sections. Now, the schemes to eradicate manual scavenging. Well, the difference between scavenged works in Europe and India is by the Hindu customs mandate the Dalits have to perform scavenging work. In Europe, it's economic necessity and also exclusion from labor. However, so there's a finance and development corporation exclusively to rehabilitate the scavenging workers in India. They provide skill development, financial assistance. And there's another scheme known as self-employment scheme for rehabilitation of manual scavengers. It provides about 1.5 million Indian rupees for individual project and up to 5 million for group projects. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, to eradicate scavenging in EU, the member countries could remedy the situation by having a target-oriented approach. First is to launch a survey to enumerate and ascertain the health status of the Romani workers involved in scavenging, rehabilitate those scavenging workers, provide them with alternate employment that could help them lead a dignified life, strengthen the equality commissions. The most important, address the poverty of Romani people in Europe, and it must consider the Romani scavenging as a form of crisis. So in the end, I'd conclude with an example and with, and then sometimes one would get a thought, why should the EU spend money, But I'd like to say that minorities are an explosive force. If it erupts, it will blow up the whole fabric of the states. And then if it comes to, so in the history of negotiations for preventing the partition of Ireland, Redmond, a Catholic leader, said to Carson, a Protestant, ask for any safeguards you like for the Protestant minority, but let us have united Ireland. Carson's reply was, damn the safeguards, we don't want to be ruled by you. Well, Roma minority in Europe has not taken this stance, and I hope it will continue to do this. And with this, I conclude. Thank you.
It's a little bit paradoxical that for someone who always advocates to defund the police, I feel like a police officer in this room. But at the same time, Ashok, I think that it's such an important conversation, and I found it very interesting that particularly the first part of your presentation where you talk about this occupational hierarchy and bringing into conversation the Burakumin people in Japan, but also the Dalit population and the relationship with the Roma. And I think that the work of Isabel Wilkerson, but also our friend Suraj Yende may be of help in thinking further about this paper. So thank you so much for all your presentations and your amazing work. These were fantastic ideas, and I look forward to reading your papers. And now I would like to invite you, Aron, to share a few words, reflections, comments, not only on the presentation, but the papers that you've read already. So please, you have the floor, and you have 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. So to the four of you there as well on the online, and also for inviting me. It's actually the first time I came down from the 18th, 19th district, which is where the Boku is, and I'm working at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences, short Boku, which is a very different type of Viennese university than you are used to. So it's not the Hauptuniversität, the University of Vienna, but it is one which is basically very much looking at these issues we were discussing here. So I just came, and that was the reason why I came late. I had a lecture which was about industrial pollution, and we were discussing exactly these issues, partly like what environmental justice can play, whether we just look at the issue that's pollution, or what are the social aspects to this. And this is, of course, a very different context. We were not talking about Roma environmental discrimination, but I think that is part of that story as well. And what in commenting on this paper, from which I learned tremendously a lot, I would like to embed this also a bit into a larger, maybe also more from the environmental policy perspective. But this is only one of the lenses I would like to see here. The other is probably like a regional embedding because all the four cases we were hearing about are for some reason or the other, or at least partially, in Eastern Europe. The Euro paper compares it very interestingly to India. So basically asking what are the specificities of this transformation and how that should relate into what we look at. And I would also like to look a bit into this theoretical framework which was proposed, and also ask here the question which maybe I just put it here forward in order for you to chew on it. I was wondering where actors are in this framework. So where is agency coming from? Because I think, and this is something what we do day by day on our research on the climate movement. It is basically here where we are at the stage where the ungovernable is emerging in the sense of in the global climate governance and all this capitalist world we are in. So here is where something is all to happen. And basically what I understood from here, though there are some additions which I learned now from your talks, is that there was a very much structure-based this description of okay what we have here and what the problems are. And I'm basically a bit trying to bring out where agency is, where agency could come from your descriptions. And then I will also, if I have time, but we can also go into this maybe a bit more individually. I will point to one or two smaller points to each of the paper, which I found particularly interesting, or also something which might be, if we think of this paper, I'm not really sure what the ultimate goal is, to go with them, how this could be made into papers which are publishable, and all the manufacturing which surrounds this, bringing papers into shape and bringing them to reviewers, and this part of our lives. So what I learned from these papers is that there are very different aspects of waste, and there are very different historicities, very different spatialities, and very different materialities, which we of how we look at it. It's both a source of income. It can be a very deadly way of earning your income. It's also a livelihood, but it's also a very highly polluting issue, which can be very dangerous. And I think this basically this conundrum of all these different aspects is sort of the main added value which you open up for us, and show the differences in how waste can be seen. So in a sense, this is not so much, we can think of this not so much around this theory of fellow, which some of you were using, but if we could also think of it as a theory of waste, a theory like centering, like if you start looking from waste and try to build actors around them and put them in structures in space, that I think we also start understanding what space can all mean. I mean, it starts from the Velovata, which is one aspect of it. It's also an economic asset of which many have their livelihood. It is also something which is as you were mentioning, it's a very typical Dalit issue which is hidden from. It's not a coincidence that Patarut is in Patarut, and your 5 where five case studies are somewhere in the outskirts. So that means makes perfectly sense that these are removed from society. And they are, of course, and this is maybe one central point I would like to stress, they are also sort of very strongly showing the world we're living. This waste is, in a way, a prison, showing our capitalist world of dumping everything. I mean, all these the tons of waste North Macedonian families are producing, and the people who are needed to take care of them. And then, of course, it's also the part of it is this criminalized issue. Like they are. What is modern? How modernization, Europeanization, as Elana would probably call it? How this happens is also this is ending up or killing some of these livelihoods. And I can vividly remember some of my field work, which was in Hungary and Romania, where we were looking at. Well, I was not looking at waste policies, but then these issues were everywhere, where you could see that how modern waste incinerators are basically changing the game when they come in, and these livelihoods do not really exist or are made problematic based on this. So what I was wondering here is what is the positionality of Eastern Europe in all this thing? Because we are I was thinking of this book, coincidentally, of Timothy Snyder, which is called The Wastelands, and wastelands from a very different perspective. But we have here again very different wastelands, which are, of course, wasted in many ways, and waste is here again a very multiplex word. So what is the periphery of a periphery, in a sense? What happens there with waste, and what happens with those people who are working on this waste? I think is something which is, of course, not in the center of your papers, because they are just located there. But I think for a larger framework of this special issue or a book or whatever the outcome of this project will be, it will be interesting to situate this also, and to situate it in that context you were mentioning, like opening it up with broader, globalizing in a sense, these questions, because there are, of course, as we heard from men, I think also from Elana's and also from the theoretical examples mentioned, there are plentiful of other examples in other parts, and I would invite you maybe in the further iteration of the paper to go into a discussion with these approaches, to open up for these approaches. Some of you have done really interesting work in this direction, and I think it will be really a very definitely an enrichment of opening up for this. Then here's my point with the 3 points more. Short. I start. I try.
10 minutes. No, I'm just kidding.
Yes. The point with the actorness is something which I'm a bit troubled with. I think this goes through most of the papers, though I think Elana, at least in a presentation, was very vocal on basically including this actor-centeredness. And I was wondering where this is actually in the theory of Falco. So because this seems to be, to me, at least a very structural theory, and where comes empowerment? Where comes those the active role of these communities or of the individuals? We were having like very different levels in the papers. So some were on the individual level. Ashok's was very much on the meta level, so more on the EU or the states level. We had the communities in between. So I think that there is also very different aspects of how agency could work. And just a brief comment, and I don't really go into this, but I think that sociology of evaluation would be also something which would sort of open up some, but I'm saying this maybe more for the editors than the individual papers, would be something which could be an interesting aspect to include here. Very briefly on the papers, what was my, maybe I'm trying to say now basically just out of what out of the blue what my first and greatest impression of the paper was. So maybe that's also will help a bit to locate it and shape it. So I'm going a bit to this matrix of question, relation to environmental issues, method, theory, like how the papers are located in this matrix, let's say. And I think we have at least two papers where this theory aspect is very important. And I think this is something where I thought, okay, this seems to be a meaningful and interesting theoretical take on it. And at least in Elana's case, I would have wished a bit more of it, more theory and also more empirics. But I think it's like on the theoretical level, you're really flying on a very high level, and I think it's it would be very interesting to locate all the possibly all the other pillars of Paleo in your work and present this here as well. Then I also enjoyed very much the paper by Jekatyerina, and I think this combination of slow violence. This is, I haven't told this before, but what didn't really come through was like how you apply this. So you were talking about the conceptual framework that sounds very well, but then in the discussion of the case studies, that somehow disappears. So you come with this differences in what waste could mean and so on, but it's not really clear how you make this link, how you link those things up. But I'm of course aware that we're working on different epistemologies, you're working on different backgrounds. So anthropology is different than applied social policy, and it's again different to political science, which is my main subject. So I think this is still like in that it can be shifted and twisted to make this somehow more holistic. I would say. The paper by what was it, Ciprian actually? Yes. Okay. Was and also Ashok's paper, like my main comment is here that you have a very long historical contextualization, and I think we would need some more of empirics. I mean, you highlighted now in both of you in the presentation what you actually do, but in the paper it's more like there's this, I would say, too long historical part, and we would like to get to Péter at one point and know more about what is going here. Also because this is kind of a famous case of Romanian and finally. Last but not least, for Ashok's paper, I mean, this is where I was not really sure where the line between a policy paper and a research paper is. At some points you present all this context, but we do not really know what the real focus is. So that I think it would be interesting actually to embed it a bit, or at least talk to these theoretical discussions, which very helpful in the two other papers. So sorry for being too long and being too late. Yes,
thank you so much for your feedback, questions, and also suggestions. And I'm in fact very curious to hear the comments of our panelists on your questions and suggestions. And I'm going to ask for your patience once more. because I'd like to gather a few more questions from the audience and then give you a chance to reflect on Aron's comments, but also on the questions from our guests. So let's open the floor for questions or comments, both from the audience here in the room, but also from our friends online. And I see that quite a few people that we know and have been friends and allies of the movement are here. So Angela, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really incredible panel. And so I just would like to highlight actually two threads, which might be a good connecting point. And basically, many of you somehow touched upon the value, devaluation, dehumanization, animalization. So I really see that this is a kind of, circulation, which might be important to think further. And of course, in your own context. But the point what I wanted to say, so that's like a value and dehumanization and animalization part, which is basically very much connected to the structural part. I know that we love to talk about structure and structural violence, and somehow all of you touched upon structural violence, and Elana was talking about racial capitalism, so all these big structures, and Elana, you were very much talking about the pride and source of confidence, right? What these women are taking from their work, from the street. So I really see that the kind of agency as well, which is somehow merged in these very oppressive structures. The point what I would like to say that I just find it really interesting and start to think about it, that how is it different and the slow violence from the structural violence? Because if we think about the structural violence, so the effect of structural violence, right, it's going to be manifested in some kind of slow death, right? And so what can bring slow violence into this picture, and how does it complicate our understanding? So I would be really interested to hear that. But I think it somehow relates to all of you. So not just specifically to Katya's and Diego's paper, which is specifically spelled out the slow violence, but how does it relate to structural violence, and what does it bring into the discussion?
Thank you so much for that, Angela. And perhaps to that point, this whole idea of dehumanization and unworthy lives can bring us also to the idea of grievable lives, right? And Judith Butler and the idea of people being seen as inhuman or erased from the conversation, from the narrative. Any other comments? Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for. I'm really happy to be here because it's my pleasure to hear that from scientific point of view, something that I used to work on a daily basis practice. This is great to be able to listen to that from you here. So I just want to, as well, related to saying now about the structural slow violence, that coming before because I think that most of the time, somehow, when we talk about Roma, we always forget about human beings and their lives. It's very, I don't know how to express myself in the best way, but it's always like that picture of the world scene everywhere. So I want just to mention that somehow the help comes into the topic of environmental justice. The people who are working as waste collectors are actually, most of them, they have hepatitis B as illness. So that is one very common thing. Their life is as well structured from health point of view on a daily basis. They are meeting that issue. So we have to, when we're talking about environmental justice and Roma community, we have to look for different perspectives. One of the perspectives of the children living in those settlements and never ending in schools. So we have a new generation ending up in the same poverty surround environment. So not all of them, not always saying about 100%, but most of them. And there are many social reasons and practical reasons why they're not ending up in school. There is mud in the settlement, they're ashamed of going mud to school because other children do not understand that. Lack of water, lack of this and that. So when that's a very practical issue. And what is as well making me worried, we have different agencies dealing with Roma issues. We have NGOs, we have now even academic institutions dealing with that. But somehow it ends up with nothing is changed. We have really together jointly to advocate, to lobby for changes in practice. Because what as well I see as a lack in the management of the issue. So there is nobody is entitled of bringing those changes into the practice. Many of them might, but they're not doing it. And I always think that when we talk about all this, and I'm happy that you're coming from different states as well, we have to go back home and to say states, institutions should do their job, because most of the things should be done by institutions. And most of the countries in EU, they should at least have an option, so possibilities to make the real changes, and they're still not doing that. So we have to be jointly work and make pressure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Pindiga. If I understood very well, at some point you mentioned a quota as a good way of eradicating poverty. Now, I would like to hear more about what you mean by quota, because in many cases in our countries, quotas don't actually work because they largely depend on the political will. You know, quotas don't work because they depend on the political situation, socio-economic situation of the country that we live in. And also, perhaps I would like to know more about, because in many countries that I know, there are a lot of money being spent on helping, how do you call them, scavengers, to educate them, to take care about their health, to ensure that there is a better way of collecting the scraps and other materials. However, I get a feeling that this actually doesn't work in most cases. Because if you speak about the number, for example, let's just take in account Balkan, it's quite a large number of people that are walking in the streets, and you know, how come these projects fail to be implemented? And we are talking here about quite prestigious organizations that are dealing with these specific projects. We are talking about the project that is being funded by the USAID or European Union or European Commission in some cases, whereby they link the environment, protection of the environment and other ideologies within the concept of aid. How come this kind of thing actually? Perhaps I'm how do you say this? I'm exaggerating the context now, but according to what I saw and what I know, it does help individuals, but it does not help to eradicate the problem as such.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. And yes, Eva.
Yeah, I wanted to ask something about this concept of indispensability. I've not been familiar with that. Yeah, so the question basically goes into a similar direction as the commentator also had about the agency. That we frequently, when we talk about waste collectors, we have this equation between disposability of material and populations. And then we tend to overlook that these workers are actually providing vital services to our cities. If they stop working, this has quite huge effects. And I think that's something that Elana is mentioned from her research, that there is also in garbage or in waste work, there is a history of quite visible and quite drastic striking activities where garbage workers just simply stop working. and the whole city couldn't function anymore. So I think that's the reverse side of the coin of doing indispensable work.
Thank you, Eva. And perhaps we should try to answer these questions. And we have a few questions that are very specific about quota or about the difference between structural and slow violence, but we also have some big questions that somehow were inspired from Aron's comments, one related to theoretical frameworks and the place of agency in this space. And I think that in many ways, Tanya, you also bring into conversation this idea related to the specific theories that we could somehow come up with in the field of critical Romani studies. So we inspire ourselves from various regions and various theories, but what are the theories that are born from our distinct experiences you Tanya, alluded to? So I'm gonna start with Ciprian and give the floor to all our panelists. I have failed at keeping time in spite of my efforts. You can see that you can just put effort into something and it doesn't always work. But I'll start with Ciprian and then continue with Katia and Diego, Elana, and Ashok.
Yeah, I promise I won't take a lot of time. I just want to answer one question from the lady from Belgrade, because this is a question that, I don't know, shocks me every time. Well, how come that things doesn't change in the Roma community in the field? I was asking myself every time I go to the field in the Roma community, so asking how come that things are not changing. And just to give you one example, what is happening nowadays in Pázmány, the Ministry of Education is planning to build a kindergarten out of field funding. There's this financing line called the National Plan for Reducing School Dropouts. And some Roma activists from Romania actually wrote an official letter. And the answer of the ministry and the local authorities was that is their right to study next to their homes and to study in Romani language as well. If we don't do this kindergarten, it's an infringement of their right to education. So this is one answer why things are not changing. Because in this kind of communities, and not only Roma communities, but usually poor segregated communities, people are living in a circle of poverty. The adults are unemployed and they have a low health. The children will not go to school, they will not access quality education because the parents are poor, and they will become worse than their parents, and so on and so forth. So this was just an example to answer your question.
Thank you, Ciprian.
I can't answer any of the questions, but I will comment on some of them, and also Adam's comments, and I think that they're fair. And I'm a political scientist too, and I agree that the theory needs to be matched with the case study, so we'll be working on that. About the structural violence and slow violence, I think this is what the paper also needs to do, is to put them in conversation with one another. To me, structural violence is really a violence that is embedded in social structures or institutions, and slow violence doesn't have to be something connected to institutions, just something that is fragile and out of sight. But I think the two need to be in conversation. I just don't know how to put them in conversation. But that's I think what we're trying to do, and we'll do it better. And then I'm going to steal the question there, which I know you didn't mean for me, but I think it's a provocative question to ask, really, how come some of these projects and assistance programs help some individuals but don't help the problem? And this is something that I think keeps coming back in many of the meetings. And when we think about it, I can't answer it, but I think the complexity of this question is something that merits a little bit of time. But we're talking about waste and garbage here. And at the end of the day, the problem is that we are producing too much of it. But is it us producing? And we had another meeting with Diego in Brussels, and this is where the conversation turned there as well. But we all know that the items we're buying have lifespans, so they're produced, so we throw them out. So to me, I find it quite problematic when you talk about agency, is to then turn to people and say, don't produce so much garbage. I mean, of course we shouldn't, and I would love to keep all my electronic devices, but they will be phased out. So it's not really my choice. It will have to end up in the garbage bill because that's what is meant to be. And it's the same with washing machines, with dishwashers, with everything that we buy. And these are just a little slice of our really daily needs. So that is a problem. And we can't point out individuals or groups. It's really the capitalist system. And I know that policymakers cannot do anything with it, but that's the problem, that we live in consumer society in which we produce garbage because we consumers are meant to produce the garbage that is, given to us through these companies. So, and then on the other hand, the problem is how to help however we want to call the waste pickers, scavengers, illegal recyclers or legal recyclers, which is, I don't think there's even an agreement maybe on this panel about how to approach this. Is this something that is a right? Like, should access to waste be a right, or should accessing waste be seen as already a tragic outcome of a very complicated discriminatory situation? So legalizing it, which is one aspect of potentially how to help it, in my opinion, will not necessarily lead to a good outcome, because some of the research that all of us actually used also shows that some of the people who engage in these illegal activities can't pay taxes, because if they do, it will be worth it. And they don't have any options because if they're discriminated in the labor market, it's not like they can go and find another job. So I mean, it's again a complex issue of how to eliminate discrimination in the labor market or other spheres of life, like education, which would give them better access to the labor market. And then we get back to the same question of, anti-gypsyism or anti-racism. I keep saying it in every conference, and then I'll stop. That I do believe that we need to engage, those who are discriminating need to somehow join the conversation and have a dialogue, because we just finished a project and it was 8 months being in the field. And what we noticed is that everybody who was what we would, probably label as racist, they wouldn't talk to us. So we couldn't even include that viewpoint. And that started at the point when we said, this is an EU-funded project. And they said, well, whatever I say, I'll be a racist, so I don't want to talk to you. So what we're seeing, and this has been worse and worse over the years, is that maybe 10 years ago, we could somehow earn their trust. And now there's no trust being earned, because they don't want to talk to us anymore. Because, well, of course, everything that's EU related will just be racist, and I don't want to talk to you. So I think the divide is growing, and the lack of a discussion or a dialogue is really detrimental to solving at least some of the problems.
Thank you, Katya. Diego, would you like to add something, please?
Yes, I mean, I think Katya really covered it thoroughly, and for the sake of time, I won't go into more details because her answer was really good. But to add to perhaps the structural and slow violence differentiation, indeed, this does need to be better explained. However, within the graph that we showed that this is actually sorry, I don't have my video on. We showed that this is actually a cycle that reinforces each other. And if we can think of structural violence, it's more immediate. The aspect of slow violence it can be a result of the structural violence, of course, but it takes time over years, so 10, 20 years. For example, in the case of cancer, it really takes time for consumption of polluted water or polluted contaminants to really unfold within the body. I mean, it depends. The time scale differs because yes, gastrointestinal issues are technically more immediate, of course, than throat cancer per se, or lung cancer that does develop, particularly for those working on the burning of metals to get the copper inside of it. But so we do actually frame it under a vicious cycle. However, there is another component that was not added within the research paper, but could be further elaborated as we develop this paper, and that is the issue of toxic narratives, right? So in a sense, how is these structural violence and slow violence and therefore slow violence, how are they, in a sense, explained through society at large that allows for this to continue? And that's something that I would be interested in discussing with Katya on how we better make that connection between structural and slow violence, but also within these toxic narratives that allows for these to exist. In a sense, basically giving justification from society at large that the structural violence and the slow violence that is actually happening are, in a sense, justified. And obviously, then you get into the topic. Then, well, how do you tackle toxic narratives? But anyway, just wanted to sort of delve on that and expand a little bit on the response earlier by Katya.
Thank you, Diego. Elana.
I just wanted to thank you so much for all this feedback. I wanted to just bring the conversation for a minute to the Aron's comment, and also this question of Aron's comment about the regional specificities of these cases, and thinking also about like why this doesn't go away. And I think it's important not just to call it like, oh, it's capitalism. I think that's a really important point, right? Like we can try to remedy these issues of waste, but capitalism is fundamentally predicated upon, you know, accumulation and waste. But I think there's also this very particular kind of capitalism that we see in the region. And some of my research is showing that in the early 90s, waste generation was actually seen as a proxy for economic development in the region. So there's been a lot of ties to actually like explicitly making it clear that capitalist accumulation in the form of waste is tied to economic development. And this was particularly relevant in these post-socialist spaces that were trying to kind of show, hey, we're capitalist now. And so I think the way that waste generation and accumulation has been marked by different policies has shifted dramatically from these early years of post-socialism to later years of EU accession. And I think it's really important to look at the form that we see not only of capitalism, but of, you know, whatever you want to call it, racial capitalism that also emerges in these post-socialist spaces that are marked in certain ways in what happened during that transition era. I think we see the legacies of that still now in a really important way. And yeah, I know we're out of time, but I just wanted to kind of add to that and just thank you for your feedback. And I'm excited to carry on the conversation.
Thank you, Elana. And Ashok, do you have?
Yeah, and thank you for the two questions. First, let me answer quotas. So in India, we have quotas in education, employment, and executive. Well, these were the guarantees. In fact, when the British were leaving India, so the leader of the Dalits, Dr. Ambedkar, also of the Constitution of India, argued. So in an independent India will not be safe in the hands of the majority. Therefore, if we have to live, coexist, we need to have guarantees, you know, and form of reservation, you know, based on the percentage. In case the percentage of minority is 14%, so you have 14% quota in education, employment, and in the executive. So that was necessary. And yeah, I don't understand why you cannot have it in even in EU, because I was reading a paper by Dimitri Kochinov for Rights and Citizenship. So so the thing that he wrote and that struck my mind is the loss to kill Roma at sight. This was in 15 and 1600s. Okay? So and then you look at the inequality. I think it becomes a just cause for Romas to demand quotas. Otherwise, maybe if you have an FRA, even in 2030, I suspect. Right? So there will not be that great change in lowering poverty rate. So I feel that it is necessary. And then the second question, giving equipment to Roma scavengers, and why doesn't it change the position? Now, I would refer to Ina from Magico's study in Albania. So it was modernized, but however, there was also reproduction of the hierarchy. You know, the Romas again were put into collectors of waste, and then again the wages were very low. So this probably could answer. And then I thank you for the feedback. So I'm still developing my papers, so I would definitely look at empirics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I make a question?
Yes.
It's related to what you just mentioned, right? Because in India, manual scavenging was prohibited in 2013, right? And this is part of the caste-based system, but it's also a response to systemic exclusion that has happened for like hundreds and 200s of years. But has it really changed anything? Because the reality still says that it still continues. We have reports coming in from like 2 years back that says there are 400 people that dies every year. Right, the number might probably be higher because this is what the data we have. So I mean, yes, we have quota system. Yes, we have prohibited but I don't necessarily agree with the fact that it has bottom from the streams. What we need is the political will, right, from the government and also like institutions. I'm just still not sure how that would work.
Yeah, but see, I think you need to have a policy because you can always claim it. So in the absence of a policy, but you looked at the data that I shared about the EU strategic framework, where there's no exclusively mentioned, but it was quite vague. So, and countries have not allocated anything, for Roma people, and they consider it at disadvantage. So, yeah, but still you need to have a policy where people can actually claim. And then I would disagree that it did not work, but you look at, percentage of people in government employment. When all the avenues in India were closed, it was only state employment in state, that where Dalits could make their presence felt. And then, and after they were employed in government, they established organization known as BOMSEF, which was a civil rights organization. So, but I think it's necessary. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I feel that there is so much more to debate, especially in relation to this idea of political will versus the idea of sharing power resources, and so on. But also, Gina was mentioning online how we can actually use the concept of necropolitics to unpack some of the topics that you mentioned, basically who matters and why they matter. Or who is disposable, perhaps, to get back to Elana's point, and the politics of race seen as the politics of death, essentially. But I hope we can continue this conversation over dinner. I would like to thank you all once again. Let's give them a big round of applause once again. We'll join us for 2 exhibitions tonight. One is called Visibility, Romania in Vienna, and the other one, Designated Sites. And then later on, we'll have a concert by Simonida and Sandra Selimovic at in the CEU cafeteria. They are spectacular, so I hope you join us to see them. Thank you all very much for your patience, your time, and your efforts and work.
Please stay here because we will open the exhibitions here. So we have one person who is in person and someone else is joining us online. So we will just bear with us with, let's say, 20 more minutes that we open the exhibitions right here. And then we will go out.